has worked for many years in industry and then moved back to academia 8 years ago. He has been with, for instance, Texas Instruments, but also with IBM, and some of you may know him from his great work on architecture at IBM Rational. And but now he is has moved to the academia and now works on the relationship between technical architecture, software architectures, and business models, and he's now more on the business side. I think it will be a very interesting talk for us to see how he looks at this relationship between business modeling and the technology. So, Alan Brown, welcome here for this morning, and this is your stage.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and good morning, and thank you for those of you who made it after a heavy night. I think some of you come straight here, right, from wherever you were last night, so I thank you for doing that. I thank you for the introduction, and what I would like to do for the next hour or so is at least try to help you with your hangover a little bit, if nothing else, and to talk to you a little bit about how my own personal journey around the move from being very focused on business process modeling and the intricacies of formal modeling in languages like Z, which is where I started, has moved into a more informal modeling approach. And that's moved me also into thinking about how organizations are growing and changing. And I'd like to try to weave that in a little bit to some of the things we see in the business process modeling world, and maybe try to challenge you a little bit about the work that's going on in that field and its relationship to how businesses are growing and changing. And then maybe we can have some discussion at the end, and obviously after this talk, if that's useful to you. So what might be useful is just to say a very small amount about where I come from, and therefore to give you some context for some of the comments that I'll make. Like many of you, having studied computer science, a degree, PhD in computer science, the focus was very much on the formal aspects of how you understand and prove systems to be verifiably correct. And a lot of the work that was being done was trying to understand in detail how processes evolve and how they're managed and how you can automate those processes. So a lot of my work was about that automation, business process execution, business process automation, and how that gets transformed into tools and technologies that can deliver that for people who are building particularly real-time systems in areas such as avionics and process control in general. And that leads you down a certain path to how processes are scoped and managed and organized and understood and evolved. So a lot of the work that I was doing initially, I went over to the United States and was working at Carnegie Mellon University for a number of years. And in particular, I started to work with the US military in the Software Engineering Institute. And for those guys, where they're putting software in the nose cone of a missile, or they're looking at en route air traffic control systems, there's a certain set of constraints around the delivery of those systems, as you understand. Starting to work with people like Watts Humphrey and Mark Polk and many others on the capability maturity model, and some of the systems around how people deliver software, how teams build software, how organizations shape themselves to deliver robust software into organizations that are complicated, led us towards thinking about the maturity of organizations and the businesses and the teams. And trying to work with that and think through that as we were working in practice with large-scale organizations, combinations of military situations, commercial situations, and the blend of those organizations. We started to do some analysis, and what became clear is that particularly places like NASA and others, they produce the most expensive software in the world. So if you're putting software in the nose cone of a missile, you can afford to spend an awful lot of time and money to make sure it's correct. For the large number of organizations we dealt with, they couldn't. That was not their world. They couldn't produce the most expensive software in the world, for lots of reasons commercially, but also because the environment in which they worked would not allow them to do that. There's no point having correct software if the market's changed, if you misunderstood the users that you're trying to deal with, if the changes in the environment are faster than your ability to change the software, if your understanding of the way in which people want to consume the software is at odds with the way in which you're architecting the solution that you're building. If the priorities around your teams, around the robustness, availability, and use of that software is not aligned with the consequences of failure of that software. So we started to think about how that relationship occurred. And that, of course, led into many things, including getting involved in the agile software development movement, where they started to think through some of the balances that were being created amongst rigor and the dynamic flexibility of software-based development. So I ended up going into some software development teams and products, and we did a spin-off company in Silicon Valley in Cupertino, like everybody did in those days. And we were very lucky that we were bought by Rational Software Corporation for $400 million, as it happened, just weeks before we were about to collapse, but that's a longer story. Working in Rational, looking at the tools that Rational Software was producing, many of you probably know some of the tools they were producing and their move into things like the unified modeling language. So working with Grady Booch and Jim Rumbar and Ivar Jakobsen and Brand Selleck and Philip Christian, the work then was around how you architect and communicate architectural decisions, how you model and manage those. At one point, I was the manager of those 4 people. Can you imagine the fun I had with those 4 guys? The fact that they were called the 4 amigos, or the 3 amigos plus Brand Selleck, I think was a cruel joke, but that's another long story for a drink. So as we started to think about that, and then 2 years later, we were bought by IBM for $2.5 billion. And the interest then, when we were working in IBM, was then, how does that move into a much broader organization? IBM was 350,000 people, revenue of $2 billion a week, $100 billion a year. You're in a very different situation now. You're in a scaled situation where you're working with large teams. You're having to try to work with large communities of people delivering change in very difficult circumstances. So my interest and the need that I had to fulfill then was quite different. How do we communicate and move into areas where the teams that we're working with are trying to sell into very large accounts? You know, how at that time, in particular, we're talking about 7, 8 years ago, how did IBM make its $2 billion a week? It wasn't by selling $1 here, $1 there. It was by selling $500 million to a large bank, another $500 million to a large insurance company, another $500 million to a large retail organization. So what they were selling was massive change, control and governance of their IT systems, their ability to deliver the functionality and the core capability to make those organizations survive. So this was a very challenging and difficult environment in which to operate. Stepping back from that, I spent about 20 years in the US and then spent 5 years in Madrid working across the European organizations. And it was necessary then to step back, and I came back into a university environment. And what was interesting was coming into a business school and not into a computer science school. The reason for that was quite interesting. I went to see some computer science schools, and I had some terrible conversations. The connection was so weak between the questions I was asking, and the few times that they understood the question I was asking, I didn't understand their answer. It was really quite odd. And I thought, this is going to be great. I'm going to go back and work in a computer science group, and I'll be back in my own community. And it was a real clash for me. I really struggled. And I tried to understand that. And when I talked with the business people, there were some challenges, but the conversations and the questions that they were interested in were much more aligned with what I was thinking about and doing at that point. So I want to try and explore that a little bit for the next 30 or 40 minutes and see if we can tease out a few things. By now, I've probably offended all of you, so we'll see if we can try and take this a bit further. Part of the philosophy here is about change and getting ready for change, and how do we deal with change in organizations. We were just talking over coffee this morning about Intel, and the comment about Intel is that 90% of the revenues they create in a year are from products they didn't even have in the market at the beginning of that year. Think about that for a second. 90% of the revenues are from products they didn't have in the market at the beginning of the year. That kind of change is getting quite interesting. And it's starting to be true in many organizations. They're starting to think about their ability to adapt to the environments in which they operate, and what that means both for the products they sell, but also for their internal business processes. What does that mean about the way in which we make decisions, the way in which we organize, the hierarchical structures, the team structures, who's allowed to make decisions, how we manage the risk of decisions, and what some of those key issues are that we deal with, and how we begin to evolve and learn from the consumers that we're dealing with, whether that's business to business or business direct to consumer. So one of the ways that we can think about this that sort of attracted me a little bit is there was an interesting paper that was delivered in the Harvard Business Review just a little while ago, which was about this relationship between R&D meets E&S. So this research and development view that classically forms what we do, which is this funnel. We have a funnel of ideas coming in, and we start to organize and manage those ideas to produce something. And it's the classic funnel where there's a series of stage gates. And we go through, what's the feasibility of this? What's the viability of this in the marketplace? Have we technically thought about what this does? Does it fit with the kind of organization we are? Can we deliver on this? And you work your way through this and you build your confidence as you go through and provide something into the marketplace. And this works very well in environments in which the questions that we ask are aligned, are synchronized with the environment in which we're asking those questions. We have the confidence of the decisions that we make are in line with what we see and what we understand in the market. We understand our consumers enough that when we say, is this useful for them? We understand what's selling in the market to say, do our salespeople know how to sell this? We understand even how to ask ROI questions, return on investment questions, how this fits with our existing channels and so on. But what we're seeing more and more, of course, is that we're having to work in environments where we know less. Sometimes this phrase VUCA is now used. The military use this phrase VUCA, V-U-C-A, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And as we see a world where those sorts of things are beginning to become more dominant, our structured ways of decision-making are getting challenged. So almost all the organizations that I'm dealing with, both on a technical level and on a business level, when you boil it down, they're in the middle of this clash. How do we create some structures? How do we create some rigor? How do we create some architectural certainty, some design certainty, in a world where we also need to move and respond rapidly to things that are changing around us, often in areas that we don't understand, competitors we haven't seen before, new ways of decision-making that are different than we've seen before, new kind of emerging architectural designs that we haven't seen before. So they're in this constant clash. So there's 2 or 3 answers that we typically see. One is we'll have 2 parts of the company. A traditional company building large-scale systems that go through the classic funnel, and we'll have our guys with the beanbags and the ponytails and the slides over here doing new stuff. I'm sorry, characterizing a little bit too coarsely. But what often happens is there's a huge clash between those. There's the guys who say, we're keeping the lights on here. We're building robust systems with profit lines that have multiple-year constraints around us. And these guys over here are left unaccountable. They just build stuff. And you say, so what will happen next quarter or next month? And they say, we don't know, we're agile. It'll all just emerge. Let's see what the stickers tell us today. And the other group says, well, we're trying to build some rigor in this. These guys look at it and say, but you don't even understand who the consumer is anymore. And you're using, 50-year-old white males to decide what 20-year-old, very diverse communities want to consume. How's that going to work then? So we're in this constant clash of cultures, of working approach, of ways of thinking about the world in which we operate. And that's really pulling the organizations that we're working with apart. And they're trying to deal with this in different ways. So we've got an interesting challenge here when we think about how we manage those projects. And what I see often is there's a lot of interest in the software development piece. Agile teams, agile software development, Scrum, DSDM, whatever methods you want to think about at the software development level and the relationship between waterfall and agile. And there's a lot of discussion and a lot of interesting maturity going on there. But what's happening in the middle of the organization, what I call the PM problem, project management, portfolio management, performance management, and you get into IP management and contract management. Those are the areas that are really challenged in this world where there's interesting change going on and a need for rigor and control and auditability and manageability. And they're not given the tools, the support, the cultural change, the scope in which to think about what that means. So I was just with a large insurance company recently with their audit team. And they say, we're really struggling here. The tools of our trade are, the classic red, yellow, green traffic lights, Gantt charts and PERT charts, weekly meetings, and a big stick. That's what I do. And now these agile guys come along saying, it's all different, decision-making's different, teams are multidisciplinary, we move as we need to. Every couple of weeks we redesign, we do a retrospective, we take our backlog, we reprioritize, we push those into daily. And we say, and I'm supposed to come along and say, did you spend the money that you said you'd spend a year ago? Are you following the plan that you put together 2 years ago? Are you aligned with the strategy that we put together 3 or 4 years ago? And we're struggling to align our control and management capabilities and our understanding of what's being spent and whether it's being spent wisely against these norms. And what we're seeing is different ways of thinking about what it means to run a project, to manage a project, to organize and control a project. And what we see is an emerging set of project management techniques that's quite far behind what development and delivery teams are executing outside of the norms of the organization. And that itself is causing a lot of tension. So the reason, of course, we see this is the world is changing very quickly. And it's changing quickly in ways that we've not been able to predict. Or even if we did predict, we didn't predict the timing very clearly. And many of these you've seen from things like body tattoos that are able to do all sorts of things. That's got Bluetooth and power on a body tattoo, and it's made of soy, so it essentially just melts into your skin and you end up just peeing it out. These are really incredible changes when you think about what you can do with technologies like that. The fork that tells you whether you're eating too fast maybe is a little bit strange. But what it tells you is there's lots of experimentation going on with technology. Can it be used for this? Now, a good example is the whole furore around blockchain right now and distributed ledger technology. We also have some projects going on there at the university. And the question is, what's it for? It's an interesting challenge to our trust mechanisms, to the way we look at provenance, to the way we think about bypassing central control of certain mechanisms. What's it for? What does it do? What does it do to change the way our organization operates in insurance, in areas where we need to understand what's happened to something over a long period of time and manage that in an effective way? And we're starting to think about that, and there's lots of experimentation going on to think through those things. I don't know if, having had a heavy night of celebration last night, whether you're ready for a pop quiz. But some obvious things. How many wireless devices connected to the internet? Well, the answer really is we don't know. But we're in the billions, right? And the numbers vary a little bit, but there are around 20 to 50 billion connected devices by around 2020. When we think about those numbers, and we think about in the home, in the office. So, for example, would you know how many connected devices there are in this room? Is your behavior being monitored? Are we doing full ECG in your seat through your skin to say who's paying attention, who's half asleep? Could that be fed back to the person who's presenting? Could we do, through cameras, retina scans to see what your attention span is? We can see the changes of the color of red in your neck. We can see your pulse. We can do heart rate variability. Therefore, we can tell stress. All of this, none of what I've just said is impossible, right? That's all feasible technologically. There's no difficulty doing those things. We're doing stuff with Airbus where we are putting full ECG in seats for a couple of reasons. We want to know if people are going to have heart attacks. It costs Airbus about £9 million every time somebody has a heart attack on a plane in the air to try to deal with all of the implications. To say nothing about terrorism, being able to tell if somebody's highly stressed and working, and their body's working in an odd way. We're putting full ECG in with Jaguar Land Rover in steering wheels. So you can do galvanic skin response, you can do full ECG. We can tell if you've had a hard day and you've had 2 beers. Should we let you turn the engine on? We can do that, right? Who's liable if we let you turn the engine on? Us or you? You know, things are getting really complicated now. So this connection of devices to the internet means we can do things, and we're in a difficult situation. Should we? Do you want that? Is it the right thing to do? Legally, is it the right thing to do? Which country leads in mobile money transfers? Anybody? Nope. Although it's getting there. That's no. Kenya, M-Pesa. Again, leading in what metric? 27% of the GDP of Kenya goes through M-Pesa, which is an app that people have to transfer money. Why? For obvious reasons. They don't trust the banks. They have a huge issue between rural and urban communities transferring money. They used to give packets of money to people to take on buses to take up and down the country. You can imagine all of the fraudulent activities there. They don't trust the government. So it all got bypassed. And M-Pesa sort of began to take a really incredible journey across Africa in changing the way people work. What did that do? It bypassed government controls. It bypassed central controls. It bypassed the tax system. Whoa, now that gets interesting. So these are the kinds of things that begin to change behaviors and understanding. And they come from often different places than we might expect. So rather than go through the pantomime, so Tesla in the first quarter of this year sold 25,000 cars. GM sold 2.5 million. Which one has got a higher market value? Tesla. So how does that work then? Because the market is about potential. The market is about what's the future look like? So how can Tesla have a 50 billion market value and they sold 25,000 cars? Well, what they also have is 1.5 billion miles worth of data about the roads and about travel. And they're using that to create intelligent cars, automated cars. And people value what they have more than the hard assets that GM has. Factories, sales, outlets, distributors, cars on the road. In fact, that's a negative. Wow, when did that happen? We're still teaching people in schools, in business schools, economics based on the GM model. That's interesting. So if you did an MBA 3 to 5 to 10 years ago, and you say, I don't need all this because I did an MBA, so is it relevant to you as a business leader? Sorry, this is just a bit of a joke. If you had 22 billion to spend, these were all, at the time, around about $22 billion. If you had 22 billion, you could have bought Sony, the company, and everything it had. You could have bought The Gap. You could have bought United Airlines. What did Facebook buy? 30 people with a product that had no revenue, small revenue, no prospect of profit, that they then made free. Why did they buy WhatsApp? 30 people for 22 billion? Because it's 400 million people, mostly in Asia, using this, communicating, talking about their likes, their dislikes, their families, their friends, what's going on. That's worth 22 billion. That's really interesting. That's a marketplace we don't understand. The Disney example is very interesting. They spent $1 billion on these bands over the last 4 to 5 years. And it's completely changed not just the experience of the people in the park. You can find out where the queues are. You can find out where your friends are. You can find out how many rides you've done today. You can find out which restaurants have the biggest queues. As you walk into a restaurant, it used to be chaos in the Disney parks, particularly around lunchtime. As you walk into the restaurant, somebody approaches and says, "Oh, hello, Mr. Brown. How's your day been going? I see you've done 5 rides today. What was your favorite? You've already pre-ordered food. Just take a seat anywhere. Somebody will bring it to you." That's completely changing not just the experience, but the processes that Disney is enacting to deliver an experience. What's the metric by which they believe within 6 months they made their $1 billion back? The metric is we want more people spending longer in our parks. If they do that, we get more money. Because they were starting to see the inverse. People were saying it's too crowded, you spend too long queuing. When you get to find food, it's a nightmare. The friction points within the operational aspects of what was happening could not keep up with what was happening in the environment. So this is really an interesting example, and there's plenty of discussion around that. So when we talk about innovation, I have the title Innovation, Professor of Innovation. That's kind of I think they did it as a joke to try and upset me. If I had to define what it is, the most straightforward way for me to think about this is it's the interplay of 3 things. How do we balance desirability, feasibility, and viability? And most of what we do is a constant search between these 3 things. Is this what people want? Do they want it in this way? Do they still value the same things? What's feasible in the market? Can we do it now? Is it easier? Is it cheaper? Can we find a new way of delivering this? And then Then the viability. Can we make money from this? If we couldn't make money before, can we make it now? Is there a bigger community? Can we find a different business model? Can we find a different way of trying to recognize value? So we're constantly playing around here. So what I'd like to do just for the last few minutes is say, this is all very nice and very interesting and the world's, ooh. What should we do? And what can we focus on? If we had to work with business leaders, technology leaders, academic leaders and say, here's the things to focus on right now, what would they be? So I'm going to preface this by saying everything I'm about to tell you is probably wrong, because we're in a world of change. But here's my answer right now. Here's the best answer I can come to. When somebody says, what should we be focusing on then, given all of this? This is what I'm focused on, and this is what I'm encouraging other people to focus on right now. The first thing is design thinking. Design thinking coming from Stanford D School, coming from IDEO, coming from the design studios, is about a way of thinking of the environment in which you're trying to build solutions. How do we understand from the consumer's point of view what we're doing and why we're doing it and the values that it brings? Put yourself in the shoes of the person consuming what you're doing. And it's not a revolutionary thought, but there are some interesting techniques starting to emerge around design thinking. How do you empathize with your client? So some of these are rather trivial, perhaps, like customer journeys and personas and so on. And you've all probably seen those. But there are other things that are starting to emerge about how you act like an anthropologist, how you gather data about what's going on, how you understand the movement of people. Let me just check. How many people are wearing some sort of Fitbit of some kind, some wearable of some kind? Probably 10%. It's interesting. How many people have got any technology embedded under their skin? Nobody yet. We're starting to play a lot with that, particularly in here, this flap of skin, some things in the neck. And it's starting to be interesting about what we can start to get back from that and how that can help manage behaviors and help to understand behaviors and where that's going. And once you start to do that, we can start to think about emotional response to various things as you're in a store. So as you know, from a phone in your pocket right now, there are about 20 sensors, including heat and positioning and so on. So if you're standing in a store in front of an aisle of coffee, we can tell the direction, we can tell your orientation, we can tell your gait, we can tell your bodily response from heart rate variability through to pulse and so on. So we can tell, is this something that's interesting to you? And as you move, we can tell whether other things are more or less interesting. That becomes quite an interesting way of saying, how can we understand your journey around a store? What interactions you have with other people, where you move and how you move and why you move. So design thinking is a technique that's starting to develop quite quickly, and we'll dig in a second. The second is lean experimentation. One of the things we've never been particularly good at in business in particular is the ability for us to experiment with new ideas. So let me ask the obvious question. What's the difference between an experiment and a prototype? Now, you guys mostly are in the academic world, so there's an obvious answer, right? The difference between an experiment and a prototype? Anyone? Yes, please.
Well, prototype, you know what to build. Experiment, you don't know what to build.
Yeah, and sometimes that's a mentality as much as it's a reality. So the experiment is you're in a sense, any answer is a good answer in an experiment because you're trying to learn. The goal is to learn. With a prototype, you're trying to often show that what you thought was true is true, and you're trying to make the next step in making that true. And that comes from, an experiment starts with a hypothesis. Here's my hypothesis. Here's how I'm going to investigate that hypothesis, so you put some sort of measurement system around that. And then you compare the measures to what you expected to happen. And any kind of learning from that is a positive learning. That's not the way typically business operates. They use words like prototype and demo and so on. And they say, yeah, it's for learning purposes, but typically that's not what's going on. So how do we create experiments, and how do we work with experiments where we need to learn, and how do we maximize learning, and how do we celebrate learning? There's a phrase that's used in businesses sometimes right now, which is called, what we want to do is we want to fail fast. You can almost never have a situation in business where you can have that conversation with management. We're going to show you how to fail fast. You'll fail more often and you'll learn more, and they'll say, yeah, right. So that